The lonely steps. The sky was painted in deep hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the nearly deserted schoolyard. A sharp autumn wind whistled through the empty parking lot, rustling the fallen leaves that had piled up along the sidewalk. The day was over, the last of the students long gone, their excited voices now just an echo in the cold evening air. But two figures remained. Huddled together on the worn concrete steps of Greenfield Elementary, two little girls sat quietly, their small forms curled against each other for warmth. The older one, no more than 10, had her arm wrapped tightly around the smaller one, who clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit against her chest. Their backpacks, scuffed and slightly too big for them, sat at their feet. The minutes ticked by, then an hour, then another. The security lights flickered on, bathing the front of the school in a pale, artificial glow. Still, no one came. No car pulled up. No hurried footsteps ran toward them with apologies for being late. The older girl, who had long, tangled brown hair and sharp eyes that had learned too much too soon, let out a small breath. Her name was Leela. The little one beside her, her younger sister, was Ivy. "Maybe she's just stuck in traffic," Ivy whispered, her voice small, uncertain. Leela swallowed hard, keeping her expression blank. She didn't want to lie, but she also couldn't bring herself to tell Ivy the truth. Their mother hadn't been home for 3 days. The last thing she had said before disappearing was, "I'll be back soon." That had been 72 hours ago. Now they sat here on their birthday, waiting. But Leela knew, deep down, that no one was coming. The sharp crunch of boots on gravel made her head snap up. A shadow moved across the pavement. She stiffened instinctively, pressing Ivy closer to her side as the figure emerged into the glow of the school's security lights. It was a cop. Officer Daniel Hayes was exhausted. It had been a long shift filled with petty disputes, paperwork, and a traffic stop that had nearly ended in a chase. He had been looking forward to going home, sinking into his couch, and forgetting about the world with a cold beer. But then he saw them. Two little girls, alone in the cold, at nearly 9:00 p.m. His tired body jolted into alertness as he approached, his footsteps careful, measured. His cop instincts kicked in. Children sitting outside of a locked school after dark was never a good sign. As he got closer, he noticed their clothes, clean but worn, their shoes a little too small. The older girl, Leela, looked up at him with wary eyes, eyes that held a quiet sort of defiance. She pulled Ivy closer, shielding her, even though he made no move to threaten them. "Hey there," he said, crouching to their level. "You girls okay?" "We're fine," Leela said immediately, her voice firm. "Our mom's coming to get us." Daniel hesitated, studying her. He had dealt with enough kids in tough situations to recognize when they were covering for someone. He turned his attention to Ivy, who was peeking up at him through her messy blonde bangs, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit like it was her last lifeline. "You been waiting long?" he asked gently. Leila didn't answer, but Ivy did. "Since school ended," she said in a whisper, her voice filled with an innocent kind of trust. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. That was 5 hours ago. The security guard, an older man named Jerry, came up behind him, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "They've been sitting here since dismissal," he confirmed, shaking his head. "I kept an eye on them, but I figured someone would show up." He sighed. "Guess I was wrong." Daniel exhaled slowly, looking back at the girls. "What's your mom's name?" he asked. Leela's jaw clenched. "I just need to call her, make sure she's on her way," Daniel assured them. "That's all." Leela hesitated before answering. "Mira Thompson." Daniel pulled out his phone and quickly searched the school's emergency contact list. He found the number listed under parent/guardian and pressed dial. It went straight to voicemail. Frowning, he tried the second number. Disconnected. The third number was the same. His gut twisted. This wasn't just a case of a late pickup. Daniel looked back at the girls. Ivy was shivering, and Leela was doing her best to keep her warm. He couldn't leave them here. He wasn't supposed to get personally involved. Protocol was clear on that. But the thought of them spending the night out here in the cold while waiting for someone who wasn't coming back made his stomach churn. He crouched back down. "Girls," he said carefully, keeping his voice calm, "do you have anywhere else to go? An aunt, uncle, friend?" Leela bit her lip. She was thinking about lying. He could see it. But then Ivy whispered, "No." That single word broke something inside of him. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right," he said after a moment. "Let's get you somewhere warm for the night." Leela stiffened. "We don't need a shelter." Daniel shook his head. "Not a shelter. Just somewhere safe for now. Then we can figure things out in the morning." She didn't look convinced, but Ivy, small and exhausted, let out a tiny sigh of relief. That was when she whispered, "It's our birthday today." Daniel blinked. Their birthday. He felt a deep pang of something he couldn't name. Two little girls, abandoned, sitting in the cold for hours on the one day they should have been surrounded by love and warmth. Something inside of him hardened. He made his decision. "All right, birthday girls," he said, forcing a small smile as he stood up. "Let's go get you something to eat." Ivy's eyes lit up just a little. Leela hesitated, staring up at him with cautious suspicion. But then she exhaled and nodded, gripping her sister's hand tighter as they stood. Daniel led them toward his patrol car, knowing deep down that this was about to change everything. A warm meal and a hard truth. The quiet hum of the patrol car's engine filled the night air as Officer Daniel Hayes drove through the dimly lit streets of Greenfield. In the rearview mirror, he could see Ivy curled up against her sister's side, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit she had carried from the school steps. Lila sat stiffly beside her sharp brown eyes trained on him, untrusting, analyzing. He could already tell she had been forced to grow up too fast. She was young, but she carried herself like someone much older, like someone who had learned to expect disappointment. Daniel had seen kids like this before, kids who had learned not to rely on anyone, kids who didn't cry, didn't ask for help, didn't beg, because life had already taught them that it wouldn't matter. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. This wasn't how a birthday was supposed to be. For a brief moment, he thought about taking them straight to the station, letting Child Protective Services sort things out. That was protocol. That was what he was supposed to do. But the thought of them sitting in a cold, sterile office, surrounded by strangers, their birthday fading into just another night of waiting. He couldn't do it. They deserved at least one good thing today. So instead of turning toward the police station, he pulled into the small 24-hour diner at the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, casting a dull pink glow onto the empty parking lot. The place was quiet this late at night, save for a lone truck driver nursing a cup of coffee at the counter and an elderly waitress wiping down the booths. Daniel cut the engine and turned to the girls. "Come on," he said, keeping his voice casual. "You need food." Ivy blinked up at him, then turned to Leela for confirmation. Leela hesitated, then nodded. Still holding Ivy's hand, she climbed out of the car, her small fingers gripping her sister's tightly, as if she were afraid they would be separated. Daniel held the door open for them, and the warmth of the diner wrapped around them like a soft blanket, a stark contrast to the cold night outside. The elderly waitress, whose name tag read Maggie, looked up from her cleaning and raised a curious eyebrow. "Late night for kids," she remarked, her gaze flicking between Daniel and the two little girls. "Long story," Daniel muttered, leading the girls to a booth by the window. "Just need some food." Maggie gave him a knowing look but didn't ask questions. She slid a couple of menus onto the table, then winked at Ivy. "We've got pancakes with whipped cream and sprinkles," she said. "That's my specialty." Ivy's eyes lit up. Leela, however, remained wary. Daniel glanced at them. "What do you want?" Ivy looked at her sister, silently asking permission. When Layla didn't object, she hesitantly pointed to the menu. Pancakes. Good choice, Daniel said, nodding at Maggie. 2 stacks. And hot chocolate. Maggie smiled and walked off, leaving the 3 of them sitting in an odd, expectant silence. Daniel watched as Leela's fingers drummed lightly against the table. He could see the wheels turning in her head, see her trying to figure out why he was doing this. Finally, she spoke. "You're not taking us to the police station," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel exhaled, leaning back against the booth. "Not tonight," he admitted. "Why not?" He hesitated before answering. "Because it's your birthday," he said finally. "And kids shouldn't spend their birthday in a police station." Ivy perked up slightly at that, but Lila didn't look convinced. "You don't even know us," she said, her voice edged with suspicion. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe. But I don't like seeing kids left in the cold." Leela stared at him for a long moment before finally turning away. She didn't argue, but he could tell she was still on guard. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. And that told him more than she ever could have said out loud. The smallest joys. When Maggie returned with their food, Ivy's face lit up at the sight of the pancakes. They were decorated with whipped cream, forming a smiley face, and rainbow sprinkles were scattered across the top. The little girl giggled softly, and Daniel realized it was the first time he had heard her laugh. Leela, however, hesitated. She looked at the pancakes, then at Daniel, as if trying to decide whether or not she was allowed to enjoy this. "It's okay to eat," he said, nodding toward her plate. Slowly, she picked up her fork. Daniel watched as she took the smallest bite, chewing carefully, testing whether or not this moment was real. And then, for just a second, her guard slipped. A tiny, fleeting smile crossed her face before she quickly buried it beneath her usual mask of caution. But Daniel had seen it, and something deep in his chest twisted painfully. They ate in near silence, save for Ivy's occasional delighted hums as she devoured her pancakes. Leela ate slower, more controlled, but Daniel could see the hunger in her eyes. She had learned to pace herself, learned not to take more than she needed. She was used to food being uncertain. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. After a while, Ivy started playing with her stuffed rabbit, making it talk with small, whispered voices. Lila listened, quiet and observant, but didn't stop her. It was such a simple thing, something most kids did without thinking. But to Daniel, it was proof. Proof that despite everything, despite the cold, the waiting, the uncertainty, some part of Ivy was still just a little girl. And that part of her deserved to be protected. A name he knew too well. As the meal wound down, Daniel finally broke the silence. "Leela," he said, "where's your mom?" Leela stiffened. "She said she'd be back," she said after a moment. "When?" 3 days ago." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "And before that?" Leela hesitated, her fingers curling into the edge of the table. "She disappears sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but she always comes back." Daniel exchanged a glance with Maggie, who had been lingering nearby, listening. The old waitress frowned, shaking her head. "Where do you live?" Daniel asked carefully. Leela hesitated again. "An apartment. On 7th Street. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He knew that street. More specifically, he knew that apartment complex. It was one of the places the department had flagged for drug activity. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. "Your mom," he said, his voice quieter now. "What's her name?" Leela stared at him for a long moment. He could see her debating whether or not to answer, weighing the risk of trusting him. Finally, she whispered, "Mira Thompson." The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Daniel sat back in his seat, his mind racing. Mira Thompson. He knew that name. Years ago, she had been tangled up in a string of arrests. Drugs, theft, disappearances. Every time she was caught, she'd make promises, swear she'd turn things around. But then she'd vanish. And now she had two daughters. Two daughters who were alone on their birthday, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Daniel clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tightening. He had so many questions. But first, he needed to get these girls somewhere safe. He exhaled slowly, looking back at Leela and Ivy. "All right," he said. "Finish your hot chocolate. We're going for a drive." And deep down, he knew this night was far from over. The empty apartment. The hum of the patrol car's engine filled the night as Daniel navigated through the dimly lit streets of Greenfield. The clock on the dashboard read 10:42 p.m., but the night felt longer, heavier than that. Leela and Ivy sat in the back seat, both of them wrapped in the quiet tension that had settled over the car since they'd left the diner. Ivy was fighting sleep, her head resting against her sister's arm, while Leela sat stiff-backed, her sharp eyes fixed on the dark streets passing by. She hadn't asked where they were going, but Daniel knew she knew. The streets narrowed as he turned onto 7th Street, the cracked pavement and flickering streetlights making it look even more rundown than usual. The apartment complex where the girls supposedly lived stood at the end of the block, a squat 3-story building with peeling paint and broken blinds hanging from several windows. Daniel had been here before. Not for anything good. Most of the calls here were for drug activity, domestic disturbances, or welfare checks. Too many cases ended the same way. Parents overdosing in their own bedrooms, kids left to fend for themselves in tiny apartments filled with nothing but empty bottles and broken promises. His gut twisted as he pulled into the small parking lot, the engine's rumble dying into silence. Neither of the girls moved. Leela just stared out the window, her fingers clenching Ivy's sleeve like she could hold her in place. Ivy, barely awake, mumbled something in her sleep and curled into her sister's side. "You recognize the building?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Leila nodded, her face unreadable. "Yeah," she said. He studied her, trying to read past the steel wall she had built around herself. "Stay in the car," he said finally. "Let me check things out first." Leela didn't argue. That alone told him everything. The apartment wasn't a home. Daniel stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the cracked pavement as he adjusted his belt. His breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air, mixing with the distant sound of sirens in another part of town. The building looked even worse up close. Paint peeled in large strips from the walls, exposing the aging concrete beneath. The scent of stale cigarette smoke, damp wood, and something sharper, like ammonia, hung in the air. He climbed the metal stairwell, each step creaking under his weight. Apartment 2B. The door was slightly ajar. His instincts flared. He rested his hand on the grip of his holstered weapon and pressed the door open with his other hand. The hinges groaning. Darkness. The faint smell of cheap liquor and something rotting seeped out of the apartment. Daniel swept his flashlight across the room, the bright beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The place was empty. Not just messy, not just lived in. Completely abandoned. The couch was gone. The coffee table was missing. No pictures on the walls. No clothes in the closet. No bedsheets. No toys. Just nothing. Except for one thing. Daniel's light caught the edge of a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor near the bedroom door. He knelt down and picked it up, his breath catching in his throat as he unfolded it. A child's drawing. 2 stick figures stood next to a taller one. The taller figure was labeled Mom. But Mom was drawn with wings. Like an angel. Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't a home anymore. And he knew, with gut-wrenching certainty, Mira Thompson wasn't coming back. She left us. He stepped back into the cold night air, his pulse drumming against his temples, the weight of what he'd just seen pressed against his chest. He descended the stairs slowly, his boots heavier than before. Layla was already watching him when he reached the car. Her face was blank, but her fingers were curled so tightly into Ivy's sleeve that her knuckles were white. Daniel hesitated for just a moment before pulling open the driver's door and sitting down. He didn't start the car, didn't say anything, just sat there in the silence of the night. Leela didn't ask. She didn't need to. She already knew. But it was Ivy who broke first. Her small voice, fragile and uncertain, whispered, "She's gone, isn't she?" Daniel turned, meeting her sleepy, hopeful, fearful eyes. She was still clinging to the belief that maybe, just maybe, there was another answer. That maybe their mother had just forgotten to call. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, kid," he said quietly. "She is." Ivy let out a small whimper and buried her face in Leela's side. And Leela, strong, sharp-eyed Leela, who had held herself together through all of it, finally cracked. Her shoulders trembled. Her fingers tightened around her sister. But she didn't cry. She just held on. Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel as frustration burned through him. These kids had no one. No home. No family waiting for them. Just him. And the weight of that truth was heavier than anything he had ever carried before. The choice he couldn't ignore. Daniel could take them to the station now. Let CPS handle it. That was the right thing to do. The safe thing. But then he thought about the empty apartment. He thought about the birthday pancakes, the way Ivy had smiled, the way Lila had tried so hard not to. He thought about the drawing on the floor, the angel wings. And he knew he couldn't let them go. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. "Where are we going?" Leela asked, her voice quiet, distant. Daniel glanced at them in the mirror. His chest tightened. "Home," he said. And for the first time, he wasn't sure whose home he meant. A place to stay. The quiet hum of the patrol car filled the space between them as Daniel drove through the dark streets, his grip firm on the steering wheel. He wasn't entirely sure when he had made the decision. Not really. It hadn't been a single moment, but rather a collection of them, all stacking up until the weight became impossible to ignore. Leela sat in the back seat, staring out the window. Ivy had fallen asleep against her side, her small fingers still tangled in her sister's sleeve. They had nowhere to go. And yet, Leela hadn't asked where they were headed. She had already accepted that there wasn't an answer to that question. Daniel's stomach twisted as he turned onto the quieter side of town, where the houses sat with their porch lights on, where parents tucked their kids into bed, where families existed in the way that these girls had never known. His apartment wasn't much. A small two-bedroom place that barely had any furniture beyond the essentials. He had never needed more than that. Until now. As he pulled into his driveway, he exhaled slowly. Leela finally spoke. "Is this your house?" Daniel nodded, shifting the car into park. "Yeah. It's not much, but it's warm." Leela didn't say anything. She just looked up at the building, her face unreadable. Daniel got out and walked around to open the back door. He moved carefully, not wanting to startle Ivy, who was still curled up against Leela's shoulder. "Leela," he said quietly, "can you carry her, or do you want me to?" Leela's arms tightened around Ivy instinctively. "I've got her," she murmured. Daniel didn't argue. They walked up the steps together, the cold night air biting at their skin. Inside, the apartment was quiet, the warm glow of the kitchen light spilling into the small living room. It was clean, organized in the way only a man who lived alone could manage. But it was also empty. No pictures on the walls. No signs that anyone but him lived there. It wasn't a home. Not yet. Leela stood in the entryway, taking everything in. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Daniel could see it all written across her face. She wasn't expecting much. She never did. Daniel sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's late. You two can take the bed in my spare room for now. I don't have much in there, just an old mattress and some blankets. But it's fine," Leela said quickly. Daniel hesitated before nodding. He led them down the short hallway and pushed open the door. The spare room was small, barely used, but it was theirs for tonight. Lila gently lowered Ivy onto the mattress, tucking the blanket around her small frame. Ivy barely stirred, letting out a small sigh before settling deeper into the warmth. Lila didn't move right away. She just stood there, staring down at her little sister. Daniel lingered in the doorway, watching her. "You okay?" he asked softly. Lila's fingers curled into the blanket. "She's never slept anywhere without Mom before," she murmured. Daniel's chest tightened. "You don't have to stay here if you don't want to. I mean," he sighed, "I can take you to a shelter or to the station. You don't have to trust me." Lila was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, "Ivy trusts you." Daniel swallowed hard. Lila wasn't saying she trusted him. She was saying Ivy did. And that was enough. For now. Restless night. Heavy thoughts. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. He sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a brick wall. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to call Child Protective Services in the morning. That was the right thing to do. But another part of him, a deeper part, kept whispering, "You can't let them go." Because if he did, then what? Where would they end up? Separated? Foster care? Bounced from place to place, never knowing stability, never feeling safe. No, he couldn't do that to them. He wouldn't. Morning light and small steps. The smell of coffee filled the apartment as Daniel stood in the kitchen, watching the sun rise through the small window above the sink. The world outside was still waking up, but he had been awake for hours. A quiet shuffle behind him made him turn. Lila stood in the hallway, rubbing at her eyes. She looked small in the oversized t-shirt he had left for her last night, the hem nearly reaching her knees. "Morning," Daniel said. Lila blinked at him sleepily. "Is there food?" Daniel almost laughed. Instead, he nodded. "Yeah, you want pancakes." Lila hesitated. Then, just the smallest nod. Daniel reached for the flour. He wasn't a great cook. He mostly lived on coffee, takeout, and frozen meals. But pancakes were simple. He could do pancakes. As he poured the batter onto the griddle, he felt Lila watching him. "You live alone?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. No family." He hesitated. Then, "Not anymore." Lila didn't push. She just sat at the table, watching as he flipped the pancakes. A few minutes later, Ivy wandered in, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She perked up at the smell of food and climbed into the chair next to Lila. Daniel slid a plate in front of them. It was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, almost cautiously, Ivy murmured, "Thank you." Daniel felt something twist deep in his chest. He cleared his throat and took a sip of his coffee. "Eat up," he said. "We've got a lot to figure out today." Lila paused mid-bite. "What do you mean?" Daniel exhaled, setting his cup down. "You can't stay here forever," he said, even though some part of him already knew that was a lie. "We need to figure out where you're supposed to be." Lila lowered her fork. "But we don't have anywhere else." Daniel met her eyes. And that was when he knew. This wasn't temporary. Not really. Because no matter what happened next, no matter what the law said, he wasn't letting them go. Not now. Not ever. The first morning of something new. The sound of utensils clinking against plates filled the kitchen, a quiet rhythm that seemed to settle the air between them. Ivy ate in slow, careful bites, her small hands gripping the fork like it was something precious, something that might be taken away if she wasn't careful. She still had sleep lingering in her eyes, but there was a quiet comfort in her posture, a kind of trust that was beginning to take root. Lila, on the other hand, was different. She wasn't rushing, wasn't gobbling her food like someone who didn't know when the next meal was coming. She was studying Daniel, watching him the way someone watches a puzzle they haven't quite figured out yet. Daniel leaned against the counter, his coffee cup warm in his hands, meeting her gaze when she finally spoke. "You said we can't stay here forever." He nodded. "Yeah." Her expression didn't change. "Where else would we go?" The words were simple, honest, but there was something underneath them, a quiet challenge, a test. Daniel sighed, setting his cup down. "I don't know yet, Layla. That's what we're figuring out today." Leela's fork stilled on her plate. "You're calling CPS, aren't you?" Ivy flinched at the word, her fingers gripping her fork a little tighter. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "I have to." Ivy spoke before Leela could. "Are they nice?" Daniel hesitated. "Some of them are." Ivy's shoulders slumped, and she ducked her head, suddenly pushing her food around her plate. "Mom didn't like them," she whispered. Leela's jaw tightened. She called them the people who take kids away. Daniel felt something sink deep inside him. He didn't sugarcoat things. He had seen both sides of the foster system, the good and the bad. Some homes were good. Some weren't. Some kids got lucky. Some didn't. And these two girls had already been failed enough. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he said, surprising even himself with how firm his voice was. Leela's eyes narrowed slightly. "You can't promise that." "I can," he said, "and I am." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ivy whispered, "But you're not our dad." The words hit harder than they should have. Daniel looked at Ivy, at her small, uncertain face, at the way she gripped her stuffed rabbit, like it was the only thing tethering her to something safe. No, he wasn't their dad. But damn it, he wished someone had been there for them. Before he could find the words to respond, the sharp ringing of his phone broke the silence. A call that changed everything. Daniel grabbed his phone off the counter, checking the caller ID. Lisa Carter, his partner. His gut tightened as he pressed answer. "Hayes," he said, his voice even. "Mark, we need to talk ****. There was something in her tone. Something serious. Daniel glanced at the girls. "Give me a minute," he murmured, stepping into the hallway. The second he was out of earshot, Lisa's voice dropped lower. "Where are the girls?" "They're with me," Daniel said, rubbing his temple. "I was going to bring them in this morning." "Good," Lisa said, "because you're not going to believe what I just found out." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa hesitated, and that alone made his stomach twist. "You know how I was looking into their mother, right?" she said, trying to find any relatives, anything we could work with. "Yeah. Well, I found something." Daniel straightened. "Lisa, just tell me." There was a brief pause before she said the words that changed everything. "The girls aren't just another case, Mark. They're yours." Silence. It wasn't possible. It wasn't. His grip on the phone tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lisa exhaled sharply. "I pulled their records. Their birth certificates never listed a father, so I ran a cross-check. A DNA test was processed through the system last year, probably routine, since Mira Thompson was flagged in a case before." Daniel's pulse pounded. "And?" Lisa hesitated. "Mark, you're their biological father." Daniel's entire world tilted. The weight of truth. His breath stalled in his chest. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's not." "It is." Lisa's voice was firm. "You dated Mira. What? 11 years ago." Daniel's mind flashed back. Mira. Her wild, reckless energy. The way she disappeared just as fast as she appeared. They had been together for a few months. Then she was gone. No note. No call. No explanation. And now, 11 years later, he had 2 daughters. And he never even knew. Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. "You're sure?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Lisa sighed. Mark, I triple-checked. The DNA match is 100%. Daniel clenched his jaw. He looked down the hall, toward the kitchen, toward them. Ivy's small, sleepy smile. Leela's guarded stare. The way she studied him, the way she tested him. Like she was waiting for the moment he would leave, just like everyone else. Because she didn't know. She didn't know that he had been just as much in the dark as they were. She didn't know that he wasn't just some cop who found them on the steps of a school. She didn't know that he was their father. Lisa's voice was softer now. Mark, what are you gonna do? Daniel swallowed hard. There was only one answer to that question. He straightened, exhaling slowly. Then his voice came through, steady and certain. I'm taking them home. A truth that changes everything. Daniel's hands felt numb as he hung up the phone, his fingers tightening into a fist as he pressed it against the counter. His mind was a storm, a whirlwind of memories, doubts, and emotions he didn't know how to process. He was their father. Not just their protector. Not just some cop who had found them on the school steps. Their actual father. And he hadn't even known. His breath was uneven as he ran a hand over his face. He tried to push the thought away, tried to focus on the reality of the situation, that these two little girls, sitting in his kitchen, had no idea. They didn't know he was the missing piece in their lives. They didn't know that the man who had fed them pancakes, the man they were slowly beginning to trust, wasn't just some stranger who had taken them in. He was theirs, and they were his. He felt the weight of that truth settle over him like 1,000 bricks. How the hell was he supposed to tell them? The moment before everything changes, Daniel took a deep breath, pushing away from the counter. He stepped out of the hallway and back into the kitchen, where the girls were still sitting at the table. Ivy was chewing absent-mindedly on the end of her fork, her small fingers wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. Leela, meanwhile, had barely touched her food. She was still watching him, still trying to figure him out. The weight of her stare made it harder to breathe. Daniel sat down across from them, his chair scraping against the floor. He tried to find the words, tried to piece together something that wouldn't shatter them. But how do you tell two children that everything they've ever known about their lives has been a lie? Finally, he spoke. I need to talk to you both about something important. Leela's posture stiffened immediately. She didn't like surprises. Ivy, still drowsy from sleep, just blinked up at him, waiting. Daniel hesitated. Then his voice came out quieter than he expected. It's about your mom. Ivy flinched at the word, her small fingers tightening around the stuffed rabbit. Leela didn't react at first. She just kept her face blank. Too blank. What about her? She asked carefully. Daniel swallowed. I found out something last night. About your family. About where you come from. Leela's fingers curled against the table. She was bracing herself. Your mom never put a father's name on your birth certificates. He continued, watching their faces closely. But when I ran your records, I found out. His voice caught. How the hell was he supposed to say this? He exhaled, forcing himself to push through. I found out that I'm your dad. Silence. Ivy's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering onto her plate. Leela froze. She didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. The world seemed to hold still for a moment, like time itself was waiting for their reaction. Then Leila's voice came out, low, sharp. You're lying. Daniel shook his head. I'm not. Leela pushed back from the table so fast that her chair nearly toppled over. No, you're just saying that to keep us here. I wouldn't lie to you, Leila. You are lying. She snapped, her hands curling into fists. If you were our dad, we wouldn't have been waiting on those stupid school steps. If you were our dad, Mom would have told us about you. If you were our dad. Her voice broke. If you were our dad, we wouldn't have been alone this whole time. Daniel's chest ached. Ivy was staring at him, wide-eyed, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Leela shook her head, her whole body trembling. "You're not our dad," she whispered, as if saying it would make it true. Daniel swallowed hard. "I didn't know, Lila. Your mom, Mira, she left before she ever told me she was pregnant. I swear to you, if I had known, I would have been there." Leela's jaw tightened. She wanted to believe him. He could see it. But she didn't know how. Because nobody had ever stayed before. Ivy was the first to break the silence. Her voice was small, hesitant. "Does that mean?" She paused, her little brows furrowing in thought. "That we're supposed to live with you now?" Daniel felt something shift inside of him. The weight of responsibility. The reality of what was happening. This wasn't just about helping two kids for one night. This was about his daughters. And whether or not he was willing to be their father. A promise he wasn't ready to break. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady when he spoke. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," he said honestly. "I know this is a lot. But I want you both to know something." Leela's sharp eyes locked onto his, waiting. "I'm not going anywhere." Ivy blinked. "You mean, like ever?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Ever." Leela flinched at that. It was the kind of promise she'd heard before. The kind that had always been broken. Her hands were trembling. "You don't get to say that," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "I do. And I'm saying it now." Silence stretched between them. Ivy, small and hopeful, was the first to react. She nodded slowly, processing it all in the only way she knew how. "So," she murmured, "if you're our dad, does that mean you have to tuck us in at night now?" Daniel blinked. Of all the things she could have asked, he hadn't been expecting that. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, kid," he said softly. "I guess it does." Ivy smiled. A small, tired, but real smile. And that was the moment Lila broke. She didn't cry, didn't yell. She just turned away, crossing her arms over her chest, like she was trying to protect herself from something she couldn't fight. But she didn't leave. She didn't run. She didn't tell him to take them somewhere else. She stayed. And Daniel knew that was the first step. A new beginning. That night, Daniel tucked them into the spare room. Ivy fell asleep almost instantly, her tiny form curled beneath the blanket, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Leela, on the other hand, just lay there, staring up at the ceiling. Daniel lingered in the doorway. "You need anything?" he asked. Leela didn't answer right away. Then, her voice was quiet, almost too soft to hear. "You really didn't know about us." Daniel exhaled. "No, Leila, I really didn't." She didn't respond, didn't say goodnight. But she didn't tell him to leave either. And when Daniel finally turned off the light, leaving the door open just a crack, he knew. This wasn't going to be easy. But he wasn't going anywhere. Because for the first time in his life, he had a family. And he wasn't letting go. Home is more than a place. The night stretched long and quiet. Daniel lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a battlefield, each thought crashing into the next. He had spent years believing he was alone in the world. Now he had daughters. The weight of that reality pressed against his chest. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He grabbed it, already knowing who it was. "Lisa." He sighed and answered. "Yeah." "Mark." Her voice was cautious. "How are they?" Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Ivy's sleeping. Leela's trying to pretend this isn't happening." Lisa hesitated. "Are you going through with the custody petition?" Daniel closed his eyes. There it was, the question he had been avoiding all night. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. You don't think I'm crazy for doing this?" Lisa let out a soft laugh. "Oh, you're definitely crazy. But you're also the best thing that's ever happened to those girls." Daniel swallowed. "What if I screw it up?" "You won't." Her confidence should have reassured him, but doubt still gnawed at him. Because no matter how much he wanted to be their father, what if he wasn't enough? Lisa sighed. Look, I won't lie to you. This won't be easy. CPS is gonna push back. Courts don't usually hand custody to an unprepared single guy with a police job and zero parenting experience. Daniel felt his chest tighten. I figured as much. But Lisa hesitated. You have something they don't. Those girls already see you as home. Daniel frowned. Leela doesn't trust me yet. Lisa let out a small, knowing laugh. Mark, she's testing you. Seeing if you'll leave. That's what she's been taught. People leave. Daniel clenched his jaw. He wasn't leaving. No matter what. Get some sleep, Lisa said. You're gonna need it. Daniel hung up and stared at the ceiling again. Sleep never came. Morning comes too soon. The smell of burning toast filled the apartment. Daniel jerked awake, his instincts on high alert. He rolled out of bed, grabbing his badge off the nightstand before realizing this wasn't a police emergency. This was a breakfast emergency. He hurried into the kitchen and stopped. Leela was standing at the stove, her back stiff as she tried to pry a very blackened piece of toast from the toaster. Ivy sat at the table, swinging her legs, watching her sister with sleepy amusement. I told you it was burning, Ivy said through a yawn. Leela shot her a glare before turning to Daniel. Before you say anything, she said quickly, it's fine. Daniel crossed his arms. You trying to smoke us out of the building? Leela huffed, tossing the burnt toast onto a plate. I was just making breakfast. Daniel walked over and picked up the toast, studying it with mock seriousness. You were making charcoal, he said dryly. Ivy giggled. Leela scowled. Well, sorry we don't have a real kitchen at school. We usually eat cereal, but you didn't have any. Daniel's stomach twisted. She wasn't just messing around in the kitchen. She had spent years making sure Ivy had food. Even if it was just cereal. Even if it was all they had. Daniel exhaled. You don't have to do this, Leela. Leela tensed. Do what? Take care of Ivy. Worry about food. Worry about everything. Leela's hands curled into fists. If I don't, who will? Daniel held her gaze. I will. Leela flinched. For a second, she looked lost. Like the idea of someone else carrying the weight was too foreign to believe. Ivy, blissfully unaware of the tension, piped up. Can we have pancakes again? Leela exhaled. Pancakes take too long. Toast is faster. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Unless you burn it. Ivy giggled again. Leela crossed her arms. Fine. You do it, then. Daniel smirked. I will. As he moved to grab the flour, something shifted. It wasn't much, but it was the first time Leila had willingly handed responsibility to someone else. And that meant everything. Filling in the empty spaces. The next few days blurred together. Daniel started noticing the small things, like how Ivy always reached for Leila's hand when they walked outside, how Leila always checked Ivy's plate before taking her own food, how neither of them ever complained about what they had or didn't have. He saw how Ivy had hope, and how Leila had walls. She wasn't rude, she wasn't mean, but she was guarded. Every time he did something for them, picked them up from school, brought them snacks, made sure Ivy had enough blankets at night. She watched him, waiting for him to stop, waiting for him to disappear. And Daniel realized she was preparing for the day he left. Because in her world, people didn't stay. And that realization hit him harder than any bullet ever could. The moment everything changed. It was a Friday evening when Daniel finally saw it happen. The girls were on the couch, Ivy coloring, Leila reading an old book she had found in his office. Daniel walked in, dropping a brown paper bag on the coffee table. Leila looked up. What's that? Daniel shrugged. I was at the store. Figured I'd get something you guys might like. Ivy peeked inside and gasped. Hot chocolate. Her smile was bright. So easy, so simple. Leela, however, froze. Daniel frowned. What's wrong? Leela's hands clenched in her lap. You bought this for us. Daniel tilted his head. Yeah. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Why? Ivy looked up. Because he's nice, Layla. Leela's gaze stayed on Daniel. She wasn't just questioning the hot chocolate. She was questioning him. Questioning why he was still here. Daniel exhaled slowly and sat on the couch across from them. Because you're my kids, he said simply. And I take care of my kids. Leela flinched. She looked down, her fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt. For the first time since she had walked into his apartment, she looked uncertain. Not angry. Not defensive. Just scared. Like believing that was dangerous. Ivy, completely unaware of the weight in the room, beamed at Daniel. Can we have some now? Daniel smiled softly. Of course, kid. As he got up to make it, he saw Leela watching him. Not with doubt. Not with anger. But with fear. Because maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe him. And that terrified her more than anything.